Okay, so you're all very, very welcome to our webinar here today on achieving refugee inclusion through values, worldviews, and identity. And we're going to explore 4 ways to connect to your community to inspire them to change. The ideas we share with you today are grounded in a research project between UNHCR's Innovation Service and the University of Florida's Center for Public Interest Communications. And the Innovation Service sought the expertise of the centre to find strategies for communicating more effectively with lessons from a variety of academic fields and behavioural science among them. You will notice that a lot of the examples we use today relate specifically to the Innovation Service and to our goal of making UNHCR more innovative. But as you can see from the title of today's presentation, we also work with colleagues across UNHCR and hope that these techniques will be valuable in advocacy for refugee protection and inclusion, and you'll soon see why it'll be very useful for those activities as well. But I'll just do a brief introduction to the Innovation Service, and then I can hand over to Annie to introduce herself. My name is Cian. I'm the team's communications officer. And what is the Innovation Service? It was founded in 2012, and its objective is the organisation to be open to new ideas, to experiment with new solutions, and also to directly invest and enable innovative work that goes on. And we work across a number of thematic areas. We have innovation learning programs that are dedicated to giving people the skills and knowledge around innovation. We have a stream dedicated to the environment and climate change, another to data and AI, another work stream, and it's good to see we have more and more people joining, another work stream on digital inclusion, which means refugee access to telecommunication networks and having SIM cards and communicating with communities and all those communication channels. We also work on projects related to refugee-led innovation and working out those processes and obviously communications. And under the communications stream of our team's work came the research that we'll discuss today. The team supports colleagues in country operations and field operations and to test out new ideas that add value in carrying out UNHCR's mandate to protect people forced to flee. And so with that brief introduction, I'd encourage you to go to UNHCR Innovation Services website to get a sense of what we do. And we also have a Medium blog, which you might find interesting if you're still a bit confused. But I'm going to hand over now to Annie, who'll introduce herself and the Centre for Public Interest Communications.
Hi, everybody. It's so wonderful to be with you today. Thank you for making time to join yet another online meeting. We really appreciate you spending the time that you have with us. I'm Annie Neiman. I'm the Director of Research for the Center for Public Interest Communications. We're located at the University of Florida. And we work with organizations all over the world to apply the science of how people think and act to communication strategies. And for the last 4 years, we've worked closely with the Innovation Service to experiment with some ideas that are pretty well established in academia, but have not yet made its way into the humanitarian innovation space. So we've been thrilled to partner on that. So what we're going to share with you today are some insights that we uncovered working together to explore how to help people care about the intersection of innovation and protecting and serving refugees. And we'll have time at the end for a Q&A and discussion if anything comes up for you. So I want to start by acknowledging the challenge that is ahead of us. As you're doing your work, either communicating within the organization across teams, or you're communicating outside of the organization with different communities that you need to engage on issues affecting refugees and people displaced. The challenge is that people make decisions on a gut emotional level. People rely on their intuition to decide whether or not it is a good idea to take action or not. And that is really important for us as we think about how do we communicate about our work, because when we communicate, we tend to communicate from our own values, our own identities, and our own beliefs about how the world works. And that works really well if you're communicating with people just like you, who are a mirror image of you, who share a similar mindset. However, if you're communicating with people who have different beliefs and different ways of seeing the world, then you need strategies and insights from research to know how to better communicate with them so you could build support for the work that you're doing and inspire them to act. All of this is to say, the communities that you are trying to reach don't share the same beliefs. You can't reach everybody with the same message because people are so different in how they see the world and their values and their identities. So what we're going to share with you today are 4 principles from cognitive and social and behavioral science that help us better understand the mindsets of communities that we need to act on our work, on the ideas that we're putting out into the world. And if you can identify these aspects of the community, by using these 4 principles, you will be in a better place to communicate about your ideas and your work and build support and inspire people to act. So we're going to just jump in with our first principle. The first thing that we need to do when we're communicating about the work that we do is identify how people define problems and solutions. Research tells us that people have different worldviews that guide how they think the world works. Some people have an individualistic worldview where they think what's good for me is good for everybody else. And they tend to make decisions and see social problems from that perspective. On the other end of the continuum, some people have a more collectivist worldview where they think what's good for everyone else is good for me. And so when they're thinking about problems and they're thinking about how to solve those problems, it's a reflection of that existing worldview. Research from Dan Kahan, who is a law professor at Yale University in the United States, studies what he calls cultural cognition. And he says that people have different cultural worldviews that guide how they think about risk, problems, solutions, and what they're willing to do and what they're not willing to do. And he says if people have a more individualistic worldview, if how we're talking about our ideas does not align with those worldviews, then it feels like a threat and they're less likely to act. On the flip side, if people have a collectivist worldview and we're talking about our ideas in a way that challenges that collectivist worldview, then again, people are less likely to act. So our job as communicators is to know how our communities see the world, how they think about problems and their solutions, and then talk about our work in a way that connects to those worldviews. For example, Kian's going to share this slide. So at the Center for Public Interest Communications, we worked with the UN Verify project at the end of 2019 to begin to explore how we can talk about COVID vaccination. This was before the vaccines were readily available, and we realized that this was going to probably be a challenge. So we brought together experts from all over the world, not just experts who study vaccine communication, but experts who study worldviews and values and psychology and sociology and all from a range of disciplines. And what we found that was really interesting is that depending on people's worldview, you would need a different message or different communication to inspire those people to get vaccinations. And we've seen this play out across the world, and especially in the United States. where an individualistic worldview is sort of the norm, where people are, whether people get the vaccine or not is very much connected to their worldview. Some people believe that to get a vaccine is your choice, and it doesn't matter if you choose not to get one, that's your problem. And if you get sick, that's your problem. And that's more of an individualistic worldview. And then some people believe, well, I need to get the vaccine to protect those around me. It is my responsibility to protect those around me. And that's a collectivist worldview. And since this came out, we've done a lot more research on COVID communication, and have found that when communicating with people with an individualistic worldview, we have to constantly highlight choice and an individual's choice in order to inspire them to see the value in getting a vaccination. And this is publicly available if you're interested in looking at it. So that's one example of what it means to communicate knowing a community's worldview. Kian, you're going to share an example from your team?
Yes, so this example comes from a research project supported by the Innovation Service, but carried out by UNHCR Strategic Communications and Outreach Unit in Washington, DC. And we wanted to better understand attitudes towards refugees and UNHCR in the US. And a survey was structured to identify unique personas, which would denote the central tendencies of a group identified through behavioural research for our engagement and outreach. And another goal was to determine messages that will resonate with those audiences and those that will not, and communication mediums that deliver the best return on our investment in communications. So the team went even deeper with the research. They examined values, worldviews, and beliefs of the participants, and identifying community organizations and local media outlets with the greatest potential to reach each persona group identified as most persuadable. And you can see on the slide here, 2 of the personas or groups that were identified as holding most potential for shifting the balance of public opinion. They're termed uphill skeptics and tepid supporters. And each of these groups had a specific set of attitudes and worldviews and ideas that a subsequent set of messages were able to be made around. And it informed the team in Washington's work in a number of further initiatives afterwards. And it really shows the value of incorporating the ways that people themselves define problems, solutions, and social issues, and bringing that into a communications intervention. And I'll share a link later in the chat to an article we have on that. But really, to kind of wrap up this point, questions you can ask yourself if you want to build in this kind of understanding into your work, this behavioural worldview understanding. So you could ask, how do the people you're trying to engage see the world? And how do they think about problems and solutions? And how can you talk about your work in a way that connects to their worldview? So that's the worldview challenge. We'll move on now to the second way. So back over to you, Annie.
Great. So the next way that you can better connect to your community and understand their underlying motivation is to identify their moral compass, or connect to their moral compass. Research tells us that people have different values that shape how they see the world and how they make decisions. And I said at the beginning of this webinar session that we sort of rely on our gut intuition to make decisions about whether we should act or not. And what's driving that gut intuition, what's helping us make those decisions, are our deeply held moral beliefs. There's a large body of research that's really looked at Western audiences, but is starting to be tested across different across the world, but it's primarily with Western communities, is the body of work around moral foundations theory. And this work says that people have different moral values that guide how they see the world. Some people tend to have values around preserving the sacred, protection of the in-group, and respect for authority. They sort of get clumped together. And some people tend to have values around equity, equality, fairness, protection from harm. And those tend to be clumped together. And what research tells us is that when we make arguments for issues we care about, we tend to use our own values to talk about why these issues are so important, which is really great if you're talking to the choir or people just like you. But if people have different moral values, then they're going to disagree with you, they might ignore you, or you might trigger a negative gut emotional reaction and they'll find a reason to justify why you're wrong. So it's really important that we start to think about what are the underlying values that really shape how people see the world and what they care about. And then our job as communicators is to communicate about our work in a way that connects to those values. For example, there's been lots of research that tells us that when we connect in the United States, when we connect to values of preserving the sacred, which tends to be a conservative value, and conservatism tends to be associated with inaction around climate change. When we talk about preserving the sacred of the environment, that inspires these conservatives who otherwise aren't acting on climate change to support climate change policy. So I want to share with you an example from work that we did at the center. Oh, I think it's taking a minute to load. Do you see the image, Kian? It's a video.
It's on the tile at the bottom, but not on the screen yet.
Okay.
We might have to just describe the project and see if we can find another way of sharing in case it doesn't come up.
Oh, here it is. Is it showing for you?
Not yet.
Oh, I see it. Okay, well, I'll start to describe it. So in Florida, which is a state in the United States, the National Geographic Society, which, if you haven't heard, is a magazine that tells stories about conservation and the environment, put together a documentary called Saving the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And this was a documentary that was specifically designed for conservative policymakers in Florida. Conservative policymakers in Florida tend not to vote in favor of policies for the environment, but tend to vote for policies that support development, business, stuff that is sort of antagonistic to climate change solutions and conservation. And so they wanted to design a story that would inspire these conservative policymakers to take action. So the team at National Geographic Society, led by Vanessa Serrero, used the research conducted by the center that I work at to construct this documentary. And they did the work to identify the underlying values of the conservative policymakers in Florida. And what they found was that these policymakers cared a lot about the economic growth of Florida, of people moving to Florida and building businesses and establishing themselves in Florida. They also cared a lot about their constituents, who tended to be sort of conservative, white men in rural communities. And so they tried to tell a story that showed that these types of people also support passing this Florida wildlife corridor that would protect a large part of Florida and help conservation efforts. And through this, after making this film and sharing it with the policymakers, they ended up voting in favor of the Florida wildlife corridor and passed it. And now we have this large piece of Florida protected for conservation efforts. So I'm going to see if I can play this. Unless, Kian, do you want to try to play it?
So it's not giving me an option to play it. It didn't come up on my screen. Maybe if you would like to take the reins of his
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Oh, maybe. Oh, someone says videos on the next slide. Indeed. Thank you very much. And now can we play it? Okay, it's bringing me through to a link to YouTube.
So maybe stop. Can you share your YouTube link?
Yeah, 1 second.
Come on. Why are you guys taking forever?
If it's not working, we can move forward.
Yeah, I'm almost there. It's well worth the watch. Let's see. Sorry, I just want to open a separate browser. 1 moment.
While that's loading, are there any questions or observations that you would like to ask at this point? You can unmute yourself or raise your hand. Let's see. I just see the letters, the initials RA. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, hello. Thank you for this important presentation, very insightful. I'm the economist in the United Nations office in Abu Dhabi, and I have a question on the paradigm, either looking at our self-interest or looking at our values and what they mean for society. There must be some middle way, and I'm just referring to this because the UN does a lot of resource mobilization here, and we tend to focus more in terms of which kind of messaging goes where and to which audience. So if you can just explain that a little bit, the messaging part, and as so not to offend some people. Sometimes it happens that these are values. Don't you care about our values? If you care, then you would donate for this work, you would support this kind of engagement and that kind of positioning. Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the things that you want to think about is the sequencing of your messaging. So you would want to start by acknowledging an existing worldview, offer your message, and then sometimes we refer to it as a sandwich. So you acknowledge their worldview, you offer the alternative, and then you acknowledge their worldview again. So you might say something like, we recognize that vaccination is a very important individual decision. This is a common sense decision that you can make to protect you and your family and those you love. We hope that you choose to get this vaccine. So you start with the individual choice, include your messaging around common sense, ways to protect people you love, and then close with a call to action that brings back that choice language. So you're connecting to that individualism while also inspiring them to take action for a community. Great, so I think that we have the video up. You might just have to start from the beginning again, Kian. But so this is just the trailer from the Florida Wildlife Corridor documentary that used this research to connect to Florida conservative policymakers.
Florida is like no other place on earth. It's the land, it's the water, it's the people, and the Florida Wildlife Corridor is the backbone that connects it all.
But we are seeing changes because of those 1,000 people a day that are moving to Florida.
We have to maintain that our environment in the state of Florida is our #1 priority. Without it, we do not have healthy water, we do not have healthy beaches, people don't come here.
It took Mother Nature and God a long time to develop this land like it is. And we just need to slow down and figure out how we're going to save it.
You're on mute, Annie.
Thank you. So you could watch the whole documentary on YouTube. It's a fabulous masterclass in how to connect to values in your storytelling. But what you'll notice in that very short clip was that there were specific messengers that looked like the constituents that the Florida conservative policymakers cared about. And they started to talk about conservation as a way to bring business, bring people to Florida, to protect this land. They used religious framing around God. It took God a long time to make this, which connects to the religious values of the policymakers. And so this is what it looks like when you take the time to understand the underlying values of your community and then start to talk about whatever it is you're working on in a way that connects to what they value and what they care about. There were animals in that video, but you didn't see anything around, we're losing our precious animals, we need to protect them, right? That's not a message that would have worked for these policymakers. So they really focused on what would they care most about. So Kian, do you want to share your slides again and share your example?
A unique country here in Orlando is lit throughout these Special Olympic Games here in Orlando, where sports the spirit of inclusion, the spirit of unity.
Everyone can just share their own. The presentation's just uploading again, so if we can just wait for a moment. Great, so they should be back up there now. Can you all see them?
Yes, we can see it.
Awesome. Okay, so I'll just get to the slide when it comes. Thanks for bearing with us, everyone. Okay, so the examples that we have around this idea of connecting to people's moral compass and their values, first of all, in reference to the project I mentioned earlier, the most powerful message that resonated in that research with the broadest stretch of the American public surveyed, whether it was people in the persona group of champions of refugee rights or hostile to refugee inclusion, was that of moral responsibility. And this argument or this message that there's a moral responsibility to include and support displaced communities was one that's quite cross-cutting, and it appears in this framework as a powerful technique. We see the influence of this style of argument in our own work in the innovation service. When we advocate for innovation in praise of being cutting edge, it has less impact in our organization than by connecting innovation to the core moral mission which drives the workforce in their day-to-day activities. So innovation as innovating for UNHCR's mandate, or innovating because of the moral imperative of doing our work more efficiently and more effectively for the people we serve. And this kind of moral language that underpins why people join the organization is something really powerful to connect with our communications. And similarly, our data and AI team in the innovation service lead their messaging with an emphasis on the moral responsibility to make technical solutions compatible with human rights. And it's conveying their work as data innovators as making some kind of moral argument in their work rather than move fast and break things or disrupt the status quo kind of messaging, which is very common in the innovation sector, that they see resonates a lot with their colleagues that they work with. I see Amanda has a question.
Hi, yeah, I'm really interested, and especially because of the topic of the presentation and what you said about speaking to the politicians' religious beliefs and invoking God into it. And I guess working in a multicultural, multinational organization, especially, but anywhere, to what extent does this help further the message, and to what extent is it maybe perhaps further ostracizing people who don't share those religious beliefs?
That's a really great question. I think you have to be really thoughtful about who you're communicating with, because if you're communicating with policymakers that are not within, if that's your specific audience, you're not trying to include every single policymaker or every single person in Florida, but these very few people who have to make a decision, and you know that they have this specific value, then I think it's an effective strategy to connect to that deeply held value. However, if you're communicating across the United Nations, I would not recommend that you use a religious, a specific religious frame, because obviously the organization is so diverse in terms of people's faiths, whether they have a faith or not. And so you would want to be very careful so you aren't ostracizing people. I think that's a really great point. However, if you're trying to organize a community, let's say you're trying to fundraise for a project that your team is working on, and you're communicating externally with a specific community, you might want to connect to their religious identity and tie giving to that religious identity. But that's your choice as a strategist, and you have to make that decision. Is this going to help us achieve our goals, or is it going to backfire? These are things that you have to ask yourself. I hope that answered your question, but I think your sort of gut intuition on this is right. Great.
Thank you, Amanda. That's a really good question. So to wrap up this moral values point, some guiding questions that you can ask yourself as you're coming into thinking about it are, what are the deeply held values of the people you are engaging? And how can you talk about your work in a way that resonates with those values? Yeah, that's about the height of it. Okay, we'll go on to the next one.
Great. So the next principle is that we have to understand where people perceive harm. So I shared with you research that said that people tend to cluster in terms of their values. One group tends to value preserving the sacred, protection of the in-group, well, I'm blanking on the other one I just said it. Preserving the sacred, protection of the in-group, and respect for authority. And the other group values equality, fairness, and protection from harm. There is some debate in the literature that says, well, before all of that, the real underlying value that really guides someone's gut intuition as to whether they'll act or not is if they perceive harm. So this work comes from Kurt Gray. He is a social psychologist at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill here in the United States. And he says before any of those values, all people are making decisions based off of gut intuition around perceptions of harm. So with that understanding and with that slight tweak to values, which I think it doesn't mean that all of that research on moral values is not also accurate. So it's not like we're replacing that and saying never mind. But what that tells us is that we have to understand people's perceptions of harm. Where do they see harm? When you're communicating about your idea on a gut emotional level, do they think it's going to cause harm to them, their job, themselves, people they love, to the communities that they're trying to serve? And we have to understand where they perceive harm so we can talk about our work in a way that overcomes that perception of harm. So I'm going to share with you an example from work that we did supporting the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's a video, but let's skip the video because the video situation here is not really working. So the Gates Foundation brought together a team of academics, creatives, people working across communications to figure out how can we communicate about global aid investment to inspire people to care about this issue again. People were, especially in the United Kingdom. What they saw in their research was that people just weren't really thinking about it and they didn't really care about it. And there were people who were antagonistic to it because they believed that there were other more important issues and ways to use the resources than investing in aid, global aid. So we did a massive literature review where we looked at lots of different literature around how to talk about global aid to inspire UK residents to support aid investment. And what we saw in the research was that there were people, a large number of people in the UK were not supportive of global aid investment because they thought that when you invested in global aid, you're taking away from people in the UK who actually need those resources. And so we saw a perception of harm where they perceived investment in this as causing harm to people in their community. So we shared that with the creative team and encouraged them through our literature review to talk about aid investment in a way where it benefits them while also benefiting the whole world, the people and everybody who needs it. And so I encourage you to look up this campaign. It's on YouTube. It's a commercial if you haven't seen it yet. And what you'll see is that in the commercial, global aid is talked about as this as a solution that's going to get us out of COVID. That's going to help us solve all of these massive problems around the world, and it's only through the work and pride and commitment of people in the UK sort of activating a sense of pride identity that this can happen. And it really emphasizes the lives of people in the UK as providing the solution to this big problem. So in a way, it was overcoming that perception of harm where if I give to aid, it's going to go somewhere else, and showed how when people in the UK come together, then everybody benefits, including you in the UK. So I encourage you to check out this clip or this ad if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, and then another example from the innovation service that reflects the perceived harm method or idea is one of the biggest barriers to innovation at UNHCR. Is when we go to teams with our innovation lingo and pleased to innovate, is this perception of risk or harm that might come with experimenting with a new solution. And when we say to someone in an emergency operation, it's okay to fail, and you learn from failure, and it's an important part of an innovation process, well, that doesn't necessarily sit well when the stakes are so high, the needs are so great, and people then came to see innovation as a harmful thing or an irrelevant thing to a humanitarian context. And so the Innovation Service, we teamed up with UNHCR's risk management team to explore how risk and innovation complement each other or speak to each other. And we explored how a judicious assessment of risks provides a framework for innovating in a risk-conscious way. So risk-informed innovation rather than risk-averse innovation, and somehow taking this sensitivity or sensibility that people have towards the risks in their operations as the vital knowledge that will then enable them to innovate rather than a barrier to it. So it's a way that we try to flip the script on a perceived harm that innovation might cause, while also enriching our own way of discussing it, and speaking more to the experiences, worldviews of people working in that context. And so that's just another example of this idea in practice. What you could ask yourself: do the people you are engaging perceive harm? And how can you communicate about your work to overcome that perception? And it's the kind of one, once you hear about it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. On to the last one.
Great. So our last principle for inspiring people to engage with your work is to connect the change you want them to make to their group identity. Research tells us that people have different identities, their social identities that are really important to them. It guides how they see themselves. It informs the messengers that they trust. We look to those messengers that are part of our in-group to decide whether this is something, whether an action is a norm or not, whether we're willing to take that action or not. And so it's really important that we think about, well, who are these people? How do they see themselves? And how can we talk about our work in a way that it provides them value? It helps them be a better version of themselves. It helps them solve a problem. It helps them have stronger relationships with people who they share that identity with. So we know that identity is a really important factor that shapes how people see the world and see each other and their willingness to act. One of the things that we see often, especially with communication around refugees, people who are displaced, undocumented, immigrants, is this us and them narrative, where it's us in a host community and them, the people who need support. And what we've seen especially in Western news media, is that us and them narrative also often frames them as a burden or a threat to the community. So we have to think about, how can we talk about the work that we do in a way that frames these people that we're working day and night to serve as part of the team, as part of the in-group, as a we, not an us, not a them to our us. And that's really the task that you need to think about when you're communicating with people who you need to build support for, marginalized communities, oppressed communities, refugee communities, is to talk about them as a we versus a them. So I want to share an example with you. We recently completed a big study for Define American. This is an organization in the United States that's working to change the narrative on undocumented people in the United States. And they are specifically focused on North Carolina, which is a southern state in the United States that tends to be conservative and not have the strongest positive attitudes towards immigrants, although we found in our research that they're actually more moderate than we thought. And we conducted an experiment where we showed moderate to conservative people, in terms of their attitudes toward immigrants, a story about an undocumented woman, or young girl, I guess woman, she was just graduating high school, who was going to age out of her visa protection that she had from her parents and would have to self-deport. And it was her story about how she was afraid to leave North Carolina. And she talked about feeling American, that she went through the entire North Carolina school system. She named specific elementary schools and middle schools and a high school that she went to, so that the people watching this in North Carolina could see that she was part of their community. So she talked about herself in a way where it was easy to see how she was a we versus a them, right? She talked about having a shared identity with people in North Carolina. And what we found in our research was that when these participants who were conservative or who were moderate to conservative on issues of immigration and immigrants read that story, the story increased their positive attitudes toward immigrants and immigration than before they had read the story. So it's really important that when you're trying to move people along on issues that they might be antagonistic to or not understand or need some push on, to talk about people in a way where they're seen as part of the group.
I see you have a question, Amanda. Go ahead.
Sorry for jumping in again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much for this talk. I think it's really important. The question I have again is just kind of on where is that line? Because I understand what you're saying about, you know, if you can frame a person in a way that people see them as like themselves, you're using that to further your agenda or your acceptance. But I also wonder, to what extent are you, or are you creating a system where if people are strongly assimilated, then they're accepted, and
Mm-hmm.
to what extent is that harmful?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it was really interesting. In our study, the number one strongest predictor of attitudes toward immigrants was someone's racial ideology. So if someone had a colorblind ideology where they didn't see race as affecting your experience in the world, they had negative attitudes toward immigrants. On the flip side, people who had a multicultural view were the belief that we should celebrate all cultures have value, we shouldn't ask people to assimilate, people should be able to bring their culture to our community, and that makes us a better, stronger community. They were more likely to support immigrants and immigration policy. So what you're suggesting is that, well, if we keep telling these stories of people who are assimilating, then we are going to create this dominant narrative where we're erasing the value of diverse culture. And I get that, and I agree with that. And I think that people who have a multicultural ideology see that, right? But that's not the choir. That's the choir. Those are the people that are on board with issues affecting immigrants and immigration. So how do we inspire people who are on the fence, or who are, well, we'll never get people who are super anti-immigrant. So how do we inspire people who are on the fence? And they range. Some of them have multicultural ideology, some of them don't. But what we found in our research is that when they heard directly from this young woman talking about her experience and how she feels, then that increased their positive attitudes toward immigrants. When you watch the clip, it's not that her culture is completely erased, but she just talks about the fear she has leaving this place that she's known as her home since she was 6 years old. And when you go deeper into like, how do you tell these in-group stories? It's not that they have to become American and, you know, wear cowboy hats and, you know, we're dealing with all the gun stuff. So carry guns, wear cowboy hats, that whole thing. Like, they don't have to be these caricatures of what it means to be American. What we found was that people identified with her experience, or they identified with her because they went to the same school, they lived in the same communities. So you could tell stories about people where they share a similar experience, so that way the audience can identify with them. So that might be, they experienced a family conflict, I experienced a family conflict, I identify with that, so they're part of my in-group. They're academics, I'm an academic. They're into running and soccer and all of that stuff, I'm into that. And you can use these shared identity points as a way to help people see that refugees and people who are displaced are just like you, and they are part of your community, and they share identities. That was a roundabout way of saying you can find other ways to connect to identities beyond being American, or yeah, identifying in that way. Does that help? Great.
Thank you. And then I have an example that also illustrates this point. And this, what you're seeing on the slide, is a prototype, early days, new internal innovation campaign that we're thinking of running soon. And it aims to connect the innovation services objective. Being a humanitarian has a vocational resonance for most people in the organization. It describes the work they do, it describes the type of lives they lead and their moral beliefs. And this campaign idea addresses the basic problem of our target audience not understanding what innovation is, and UNHCR is holding a mirror and saying what you are doing is innovation, and being a humanitarian is being an innovator. And that helps bring a perception of people working in innovation as being in the same group main humanitarian identity marker. And yeah, you see the gap on the first one. That's to allow many different words that reflect common aspects of work in UNHCR to be shown as having a link with the idea of innovation. And yeah, the aim is to create some kind of broad church association with the term that links under this idea of innovation as humanitarian. But this is a way that one might apply in the very specific this principle. How can you tell stories to help people see refugees as part of the in-group? And there are nuances to that, as Annie and Amanda just discussed. But really, this is our question. How can we move past the damaging narratives and stories that circulate in communities, in political institutions, in media, that affect experiences and real life political social outcomes for displaced people. And I think a number of these techniques could be powerful in those kind of interventions and advocacy. So that's where all we really have to share with you today. We're going to go to questions and observations. We might have time for only one or two, but please do feel free to raise a hand or to ask a question.
While you're thinking about a question or what you want to share, Kian and I have a few next steps for you all if you're interested in learning more about this work. So at the Center for Public Interest Communications, there's lots of ways that you can learn more about this work and plug into our world. So we've partnered with the Innovation Service now for 4 years. So we do partnerships. We also do robust trainings. There's an online master's program at our university that you could, it's all online if you wanted to learn more about this research and you're thinking about getting a master's degree. But if not, skip that. But then also every year we host a gathering or a conference for people who do this sort of work, who are interested in applying science to how they design for social change, and that's thefrankgathering.org. And also, if you're just interested in learning more about the research, on our website we have lots of articles where we've written about these ideas, and you can read through those articles. They're all open access and free, and start to experiment with applying them to your work.
And similarly, if the information today has sparked an interest, I would invite you to go to the communications research link here. It's a Medium publication called Bending the Arc, and it has all of the research which also stretches into many other areas linked to what we talked about today. And that publication is called Bending the Arc, or The Arc, and you'll find it there. And there's also, if you're curious about the Innovation Services work, much more stories and project summaries and information on our website and our main Innovation Service blog. Contact info, yes, surely. And we might have time for one question. Yes, so I'll post the links in has sent it, if that we want, and an email address.
Great. Well,
okay, I think we can wrap
thank you,
up
everybody.
there.
We're so sorry for the technical delays, but we're so grateful you spent this time with us, and we hope that this has been helpful. And please reach out to either of us if you have any questions or are searching for any resources, and we can be a help to you. Have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.